Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today, we are taking a deep dive into the source material to look at a really fascinating literary feature in the English Bible. And, well, it functions as a theological window into divine providence. We are talking about dramatic irony.
Yeah, and I mean, it is such an incredible topic to unpack. It is one of those things where once you see it in the text, you really cannot unsee it.
All right, absolutely. So to start us off, I want you to imagine that you are standing on a balcony, looking down at this grand, sprawling stage play. From up there, you can see all the characters at once.
Oh, that is a great analogy.
Yeah, so you watch them down there whispering secrets in the shadows. You see them setting these elaborate traps for one another, and you listen to them boasting about their brilliant, foolproof schemes.
Right, and down on the stage, they're completely convinced they're calling all the shots.
Yes, but from your vantage point on the balcony, you hold the script. You know the director has already written the final act. So you see the trapdoor right behind the villain that he does not know is there.
I mean, that specific feeling, knowing the true outcome while the characters remain totally blind to it, that is what literature calls dramatic irony.
Right. And the mission today is to dig into how this is not just some clever artistic choice. We're looking at two primary case studies from our sources, the Persian court in the Book of Esther and the religious Sanhedrin in the Gospel of John.
Yeah, and we are going to see how the biblical authors use this method to show that God reigns over human intentions. He turns the hostile calculations of men into the precise mechanisms of his grace.
Absolutely. So let us get into the theological framework here first.
Well, when we look at these scriptural narratives through the framework of providence, we recognize a core tenet, that God from all eternity freely and unchangeably ordains whatsoever comes to pass.
Right, which aligns so well with the Westminster Confession.
Yes, it does. And when you apply that lens, you realize that dramatic irony entirely dismantles the idea of human autonomy. It just shatters it.
I mean, it also shatters the false concept of a passive God, a God who just sits back in heaven and reacts to our human choices.
Precisely. Instead, history is a meticulously written divine script. A pagan king might speak with absolute arrogance, or a religious villain might construct a lethal weapon, but the reader already knows that heaven laughs.
Unregenerate man boasts of his independence, yet he's entirely blind to the overarching counsel of God directing his every step. The literary structures of Scripture are theological declarations, proving that history contains no random accidents.
Yeah, there is no chaos, just unseen order.
Okay, so let us unpack this by stepping into our first historical scene. I want to spend some real time setting the stage here because the context makes the irony so much sharper.
Sure, we really need to understand the world these characters are operating in.
Right. We are looking at the post-exilic Persian Empire, specifically during the reign of King Ahasuerus, and in secular records he is historically identified as Xerxes I.
Yes, and if you are listening to this, you really have to understand the sheer scale of this empire. It is staggering.
I mean, it stretched from India all the way to Ethiopia. It was a massive, multi-ethnic, totalitarian superpower.
And sitting inside this empire is the Jewish diaspora. This is an incredibly precarious situation for them. They are a very vulnerable minority.
Right, because they have no sovereign king sitting on a throne in Jerusalem. They have no visible Ark of the Covenant to look at for assurance. They have no immediate prophets walking the streets declaring the word of the Lord.
They're essentially scattered across pagan provinces, living in the shadow of a regime that could crush them on a whim. It is a dark, suffocating environment for the covenant people.
Yeah, they are strangers in a strange land, completely subjected to the bureaucratic whims of Susa, which is the capital city.
And within that volatile political backdrop, we see the rise of a man named Haman. He is elevated to the position of prime minister.
So he is essentially second in command to the king.
Right. Yes, absolutely. But the text gives us a specific biographical detail about Haman that we really cannot rush past. The author identifies him as an Agagite.
I want to pause you right there, because if someone is just reading through Esther casually, the word Agagite just sounds like another ancient demographic. Why does this blood feud matter so much to the story?
Well, it matters because this is not a new conflict. It is actually the climax of a centuries-old war. And Agagite is a descendant of Agag, the king of the Amalekites.
And the Amalekites were the archetypal enemies of God's covenant people, right?
Yes, exactly. They launched a cowardly, predatory attack against Israel during the wilderness wanderings in Exodus 17. They attacked the stragglers, the weak, and the exhausted at the rear of the Israelite camp.
Oh, wow. So it was a very specific, targeted strike against the most vulnerable.
Right. And because of that specific attack, God declared a perpetual war against Amalek from generation to generation.
So then you fast forward to 1 Samuel 15, right?
Yes, and King Saul is explicitly commanded by God to execute total judgment on the Amalekites. But Saul disobeys. He keeps King Agag alive as a trophy.
And then the prophet Samuel has to step in and execute Agag himself.
Correct. Now, centuries later in Persia, we have Haman, a descendant of Agag, stepping into absolute political authority. And who is his primary target? It is Mordecai.
And the text goes out of its way to tell us Mordecai is a Benjamite, a descendant of Kish.
Right.
Wait, Kish? That is the exact same family line as King Saul, isn't it?
Precisely. This is a historical rematch. You have the descendant of King Saul facing off against the descendant of King Agag.
So Haman's systemic hatred of Mordecai and, his subsequent hatred of the entire Jewish people, that is the continuation of this ancient blood feud.
Yes. Haman uses his political leverage to secure an irrevocable royal decree. It is signed with the king's signet ring, and it orders an empire-wide genocide of the Jews on a specific day.
So for Haman, this is not just about removing a political rival who will not bow to him.
No, not at all. This is an existential threat aimed at the physical seed of Abraham. He wants to finish the war his ancestors started.
So let us look at the theological stakes here. If Haman actually succeeds, what happens to the entire biblical story? Because, well, this feels a lot bigger than just one political crisis in Susa.
It is massive. If you are a reader tracking the promises of God from Genesis onward, this decree should terrify you. If Haman succeeds, the biblical story collapses completely.
Because the physical preservation of the ethnic line of Israel was a non-negotiable necessity, right?
Absolutely. God made very specific physical promises to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, and to David. It was from this specific physical seed of Judah that the Messiah, Jesus Christ, had to be born.
Wow, so if the Persian genocide succeeded, the human line of David would have been severed forever.
Yes, the Virgin Mary would never have been born. The genealogies we read in Matthew and Luke would be wiped out before they could be completed. The promises of God would be nullified.
And Satan would have claimed a definitive victory over the decrees of Yahweh. So the conflict in Susa is this existential struggle for the integrity of God's entire redemptive plan for humanity.
Right. And knowing those massive stakes, here is the detail that is so fascinating. When you read the Book of Esther, the most striking literary feature is a massive vacuum.
You mean the fact that God's name is completely absent?
Yes. The author never explicitly mentions Yahweh, Elohim, or any divine title. There is no mention of the law, no mention of sacrifices, and no explicit prayers recorded.
I mean, from a modern reader's perspective, it almost feels like a secular historical thriller at first glance. Why would the author leave God out of a story where God's promises are on the brink of annihilation?
That deliberate omission is a brilliant rhetorical technique. It is designed to highlight a concept theologians call providentia occulta.
Okay, I am going to have to ask you for an explanation of that Latin phrase. What does that mean for the person listening right now?
Sure, it translates to hidden providence. The author deliberately constructed the narrative this way so the reader is forced to look closer.
So, by hiding God explicitly, the author makes his actions visible implicitly in every single detail.
Yes, it is a literary strategy that demands the reader pay attention to what looks like a series of absurd, random coincidences. The text is actually built on a grand structural inversion, what literary scholars call a chiasmus.
Right, a chiasmus is like a mirror image story structure, isn't it? Where
Wow.
the first half of the story builds up to a peak, and then the second half mirrors the first half, but in reverse.
That is right. You have Haman's unchecked escalation and the impending doom of the Jews building up step by step in the first half. Then, right at the exact chiasmic turning point in the center of the book, the fortunes of the characters are completely inverted.
And the second half mirrors the first, but with the Jews triumphing.
Yes, and because God's name is omitted from the text, the reader has to ask, well, who is flipping this mirror? Who is orchestrating this massive reversal?
So the hiddenness of God in the text forces you to acknowledge his absolute sovereignty over the events.
Absolutely.
Let us zoom right into that turning point. We are looking at the central pivot of Esther chapter 6. I want to paint the picture of the agonizing tension here. Haman has just built a massive wooden gallows.
And the text says it is 50 cubits high. That is roughly 75 feet tall, so about the height of a 7-story building.
Wow, that is huge. And he builds it right in his own courtyard, designed specifically to impale Mordecai so the whole city can see it. It is just a monument to pure narcissism.
Yeah, Haman is gloating. He goes home boasting to his wife and friends about his vast wealth, his promotions, and his exclusive dinner invitation from Queen Esther.
Meanwhile, Mordecai is dressed in sackcloth and ashes, mourning the impending death of his people.
But right between Haman's boastful dinner and the planned execution the very next morning, something incredibly mundane happens.
Right, the most powerful man in the world, King Ahasuerus, goes to bed, and he cannot sleep.
And this is where the original Hebrew text gives us a stunning insight into how Providence operates. In Esther 6.1, English translations usually say something like, "On that night the king could not sleep."
But the Hebrew is more specific, right?
Yes, the literal Hebrew verb used there is nadada. This is a very rare word. It appears only 28 times in the entire Hebrew Bible.
And what does it usually describe?
It is typically used to describe birds actively fluttering and fleeing from a nest, or exiles running away in terror from a pursuing sword.
Oh, wow. So applying this specific verb to sleep is highly unusual.
Very unusual. Sleep did not just gently drift away from King Ahasuerus. It actively fled from him. It ran away like a fugitive fleeing an arresting officer.
So this was no biological fluke or result of indigestion. God actively evicted sleep from the king's eyes.
Yes, he did.
Wait, let me play devil's advocate for the listener here. If God is literally forcing the king to stay awake, taking away his natural ability to sleep, and then forcing the scribes to turn to a specific page in a book, does that not turn humans into mere robots?
That is a very common objection.
I mean, how is this not just divine puppetry? If God is micromanaging his Ermin cycle, where is the king's actual will in this?
Well, that is the crucial philosophical question, and the Reformed framework answers it through the concept of compatibilism.
Compatibilism, meaning two things are compatible.
Right. It is the understanding that God's absolute sovereignty and human volition are not mutually exclusive. They are entirely compatible. God does not operate by violating the nature of the creature.
So how does he do it without violating their nature?
We differentiate between primary causes and secondary causes. God is the primary cause. He's the grand architect of the play you mentioned earlier. But he ordains events to happen through secondary causes.
And secondary causes would be things like natural laws or our biological functions and the genuine choices of human beings.
Yes. God sustained the biological reality of the king's mind. The king's insomnia was a genuine physical secondary cause. He really felt restless. He really chose to ask for a book to pass the time.
So God is not pulling levers in the king's brain like a machine.
No, rather, God providentially governs the entire fabric of reality so that the king's natural restlessness accomplishes a divine purpose. The word nedada is a poetic theological way to describe the precise orchestration of these ordinary secondary events by the primary cause.
That makes a lot of sense. God is the author, but the characters are still genuinely speaking their lines. So the king is wide awake, and out of all the things he could have asked for in a Persian palace, music, wine, concubines, entertainment, he asks for the royal chronicles.
Yes, the dry, mundane court records to be read to him. He is basically asking for a boring book to help him fall back asleep.
And the scribes open the scroll and turn right to the specific page where it is recorded that Mordecai saved the king's life from an assassination plot by two eunuchs.
And right there, the king stops the reading and asks what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this.
The servants say nothing. Then, right at that exact moment, we hear footsteps in the outer court. It is Haman.
He's come in the middle of the night to ask permission to hang Mordecai on that 75-foot gallows.
The king calls him in and asks him an incredibly ambiguous question, right? He says, "What shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor?"
Haman's reaction to that question exposes his total depravity. The Hebrew text gives us a window into his internal monologue. It says Haman spoke belibo, which translates to in his heart.
And in biblical psychology, the heart is not just about emotions, is it?
No, it is not. The heart is the center of the intellect, the will, and moral decision-making. By exposing Haman's internal thoughts, the author lets us peer into a completely unregenerate, narcissistic mind.
So Haman asks himself, whom would the king delight to honor more than me?
He is so blinded by his lust for self-exaltation that he cannot even conceive of a universe where anyone else receives royal favor. He assumes he is the center of the Persian universe.
So he designs a lavish parade. He suggests taking royal robes the king has worn, a horse the king has ridden, and placing a royal crest on the horse's head.
Right, because he assumes he is designing his own coronation parade.
I have to admit, The holy sarcasm in this scene is brilliant. The divine reversal is absolute. The king listens to this elaborate, arrogant parade idea, nods, and says, "Make haste, and take the apparel and the horse, as thou hast said, and do even so to Mordecai the Jew that sitteth at the king's gate."
And he adds, "Let nothing fail of all that thou hast spoken." I could only imagine the blood draining from Haman's face.
Oh, absolutely. He is forced to act as a royal herald, leading the horse himself, parading his mortal enemy through the streets of Susa, shouting his praises to the entire city. This entire sequence just refutes any philosophy that attributes history to blind chance.
It absolutely refutes it. It demonstrates what theologians call providentia specialissima, which is the special providence of God.
Meaning God cares about the tiny details.
Yes. This is the understanding that God's governance does not just apply to broad, sweeping historical movements, but extends to the most granular details of life.
So, this governance covers the insomnia of a pagan king, the page-turning of court scribes, the precise timing of Haman entering the courtyard, and the specific phrasing of the king's question.
Exactly. God does not just defeat his enemies with a lightning bolt from heaven. He governs their own actions so they force themselves to participate in the public vindication of his people.
And that 75-foot trap Haman built snaps shut on his own neck. He is eventually executed on the very gallows he constructed for Mordecai.
It is a stunning display of dramatic irony.
So we see this dramatic irony operating clearly when God's people are a vulnerable minority in a pagan empire. But does this dynamic change when the threat comes from inside the house?
That is a great question.
You know, when the villains aren't pagan kings, but the very religious leaders who are supposed to be serving God. Let us transition to the New Testament to see this same divine irony operating within a corrupt religious establishment.
Right, moving from Susa to the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem.
And the catalyst for this crisis is found in the Gospel of John, chapter 11. Jesus has just performed his greatest, most undeniable public sign. He raised Lazarus from the dead.
And Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days. In Jewish thought at the time, there was a belief that the soul might hover near the body for 3 days, hoping to re-enter.
But by day 4, decomposition has started. Death is absolute and undeniable.
Yes. And Jesus walks up, speaks a word, and a dead man walks out in grave clothes.
If you are a listener imagining the scene, you would think seeing a man walk out of a tomb would spark universal worship. But instead, it sparks a lethal conspiracy.
The reaction of the religious council exposes the absolute disorder of unbelief. The chief priests and Pharisees convene the Sanhedrin in a state of sheer panic.
What is vital to notice is that they do not deny the miracle, do they?
No, they openly admit that Jesus is performing many signs. The evidence is walking around Bethany breathing air. But instead of falling on their knees and acknowledging him as the Messiah, they ask a purely managerial, pragmatic question.
They say, what are we doing?
Right. They fear that if they let Jesus continue, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away their place, meaning the temple and their settled religious order and their nation.
I want to make this real for the person listening. Think about the psychology here. Imagine you are looking directly at a man who just emptied a tomb. A man who demonstrated absolute terrifying authority over the grave itself.
And your only thought is how this miraculous event might hurt your political standing with the local governor.
It is a terrifying level of spiritual blindness.
It reveals a tragic irony at the heart of their worldview. They fear the Roman Empire far more than they fear the God of Abraham.
Because the Sanhedrin held their authority at the pleasure of the Roman occupation, right?
Yes. Any messianic uprising, any massive gathering of crowds threatened the fragile peace. They treat the true Messiah as a threat to Israel's survival.
So they believe that by rejecting Christ and maintaining the status quo, they are saving the visible temple.
But in reality, they are rejecting the true temple, the very meeting place of God and man, which is the body of Jesus Christ.
And the historical result of their unbelieving pragmatism was catastrophic. The sources point out that the very destruction they tried to avoid by plotting against Jesus became a devastating reality.
Right, in AD 70. The Roman legions, led by Titus, came and completely destroyed Jerusalem and dismantled the temple block by block.
So those who reject Christ to save their own kingdoms lose the very things they tried to protect.
Absolutely.
Out of this panicked, unbelieving council steps the high priest, Caiaphas, and he provides one of the most theologically luminous examples of dramatic irony in all of Scripture.
He really does. He stands up and addresses the council with staggering arrogance. Caiaphas speaks with cold, brutal authority.
What does he actually say in the Greek text?
He uses a highly patronizing, emphatic phrase, "Hymes uk oided odin." It literally translates to, absolutely nothing at all.
Wow, so he dismisses the entire council of educated religious leaders as fools.
Yes, and then he offers his political solution. He advocates for the logic of pure expediency. He uses the Greek word symphori, meaning it is advantageous or it is profitable.
He suggests a cold-blooded political murder to appease the Roman authorities.
Right. He says, it is advantageous that one man die for the people so the whole nation does not perish. He treats Jesus of Nazareth as a completely expendable victim for the sake of institutional survival.
Let me ask you about the office of the high priest at this specific time in history. Because if Caiaphas is corrupt, if he is a political hack just trying to save his own skin, why does God use his voice?
That is a fascinating historical detail. By the 1st century, the high priesthood had been heavily compromised. It was no longer a purely hereditary, lifelong role, strictly following the Levitical laws.
So the Romans were involved in appointing them.
Yes. The Roman authorities, specifically men like Valerius Gratus and later Pontius Pilate, appointed and deposed high priests based on political loyalty.
So Caiaphas was a political appointee.
He was. And he managed to hold the office for a remarkably long time because he knew how to play ball with Rome. However, despite the corruption of the man holding the office itself still retained its covenantal function in the plan of God.
The high priest was still the designated representative and communicator between God and Israel.
Precisely.
So God honors the structure of the office even while the man in it is acting wickedly. Because the Apostle John provides this inspired commentary right after Caiaphas speaks.
And it acts as a divine hijacking of Caiaphas's vocal cords. John writes that Caiaphas did not speak this from himself. Because he was high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation.
And not for that nation only, but to gather into one the scattered children of God. God overrode Caiaphas's wicked intention to declare the glorious truth of substitutionary atonement.
Caiaphas meant one expendable political victim. God meant one perfect mediator.
If someone is new to theological terms, substitutionary atonement simply means God stepping in to take the penalty for sin in our place. Christ substitutes himself for the guilty.
And this specific moment brings up vital philosophical implications regarding how human guilt and divine sovereignty coexist.
Right, because Caiaphas is fully 100% guilty of murder.
He acted out of pure, pragmatic self-preservation and malice. Yet God is fully 100% sovereign in utilizing that sinful intention to accomplish the redemption of the world.
God superintended the speech so that, entirely beyond Caiaphas's own design or understanding, his words conveyed absolute prophetic truth.
Think about the layers of irony here. The high priest, whose entire daily office is connected to offering animal sacrifices and making intercession for the sins of the people, unwittingly announces the death of the ultimate, final sacrifice.
God ordains the saving death while the men commit the wicked act. Their guilt is not reduced by God's sovereign decree, and God's saving purpose is never threatened by their guilt.
It is a stunning reality.
I love looking at how this fits into the larger picture of Scripture. This prophecy from Caiaphas is not an isolated incident. If we pull back and look at the whole scriptural narrative, we see this broader canonical pattern.
We do.
The sources you provided show that the plotting of the wicked consistently accelerates God's redemptive plan. It never derails it.
The pattern is remarkably consistent throughout biblical history. Let us look at Joseph and his brothers in the book of Genesis.
Right. His brothers hated him out of jealousy. They plotted murder and eventually sold him into slavery in Egypt to eliminate him from the family completely.
But that very act of betrayal, that specific caravan to Egypt, became the exact path by which God preserved the physical line of Israel during a massive regional famine.
And Joseph himself explicitly points out the dramatic irony at the end of the book, doesn't he?
Yes, he looks at his terrified brothers and tells them, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good."
Notice the phrasing there. He does not say God used it for good after the fact. He says God meant it for good from the beginning.
Exactly. We see the same dynamic with Pharaoh in Exodus. His cruelty and systematic oppression of the Israelites did not defeat God's people. It set the stage for the Exodus, magnifying God's name and might across the known world.
We also see it with the prophet Balaam in the book of Numbers.
Right. He was hired by a hostile king, Balak, for the specific purpose of cursing Israel. But every time Balaam opened his mouth to pronounce a curse, God constrained his tongue and turned the attempted curses into blessings.
Unbelief continually fails to read Providence correctly. Unregenerate men see events purely on a horizontal, earthly level and entirely miss the God who governs those events from above.
They miss the balcony view completely.
And all of these historical patterns, Joseph, Pharaoh, Balaam, Haman, Caiaphas, they all bring us to the ultimate reversal, the absolute climax of dramatic irony in the history of the universe.
The cross of Calvary.
Just as Haman built the wooden gallows in Susa, the Sanhedrin and the Roman Empire collaborated to build the cross in Jerusalem.
And to the unregenerate eye, the cross looked like the final, devastating defeat of the Messiah. The disciples fled. The sky went dark. It looked like the kingdom had failed.
Unbelief viewed the cross as the violent termination of Jesus' movement. But the Apostle Paul gives us the reality from the balcony view.
Yes, in Colossians 2:15, Paul exposes the cosmic irony of the crucifixion. He writes that at the cross, God disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him.
So the very instrument designed by the Romans for maximum torture, humiliation, and the destruction of the Son of God, that was the exact tool God decreed from eternity past to pay the penalty for the sins of his sheep.
And to defeat Satan. Look at the mockery leading up to the crucifixion. The Roman soldiers wove a crown of thorns and forced it onto his head. They draped him in a purple robe.
Pilate ordered a sign to be nailed above his head reading, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews."
They intended every single one of these actions as vicious, sarcastic mockery, but in the grand script of Providence, they are actually conducting the coronation of the true king.
He was reigning through his humiliation, his perfect obedience, and his substitutionary death.
The sources point out that this substitutionary view of the cross stands in direct contrast to modern liberal theology.
Right, which often frames the crucifixion just as a tragic accident, or perhaps just a sad moral example of a good man dying unjustly at the hands of a corrupt system.
The biblical text demands that we reject any theological framework that strips the cross of its penal substitutionary character. The cross was not a failure of Christ's mission. It was the entire purpose of his incarnation.
It was a propitiatory sacrifice, meaning a sacrifice that absorbs the wrath of God against sin, planned before the foundation of the world.
In Acts chapter 4, the early church prays and acknowledges this directly. They say that Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, gathered together against Jesus.
But they only did whatever God's hand and God's plan had predestined to take place.
What the enemy intended for total destruction, God governed and utilized as the fountain of eternal life for his people.
Okay, let us bring this right down to the listener. What does all this mean for us today, practically speaking?
It has massive implications.
If someone is listening to this while driving to work or folding laundry, how does understanding this divine dramatic irony change the way they live their daily life?
Well, the sources offer some very direct applications, starting with a stark warning against falling into the pragmatism of the Sanhedrin.
The spirit of Haman and the spirit of Caiaphas are still very active inside the modern church.
Yes, whenever a congregation or a church leader relies on pragmatic scheming to survive, they are adopting the mindset of the Sanhedrin.
Whenever churches soften clear biblical doctrine to gain cultural approval or rely on secular marketing strategies to avoid hostility from the surrounding culture, they are functionally rejecting God's absolute sovereignty.
Caiaphas looked at a miracle and asked, "What will save our place?" instead of asking, "What will honor the Lord?"
The church today does not need to compromise its distinct identity, its moral standards, or its theology to survive in a hostile culture.
Our deliverance comes from the sovereign Lord, not from clever human strategies. When we scheme and compromise, we are acting like characters on the stage who think they have to write the script to save themselves.
There's also a personal call to examine our own hearts for the narcissism of Haman. It is easy to point fingers at an ancient Persian prime minister, but every single time we try to build our own little kingdoms at work or in our social circles, we echo that ancient pride.
We really do. Every time we demand the praise of men or assume that we are the center of the story, we are speaking bellibo in our hearts, just like Haman.
Furthermore, every time we complain bitterly about the specific providences God has placed in our lives, the inconveniences, the unfulfilled desires, the lack of recognition, we're essentially telling the director that his script is flawed. We have to repent of self-exaltation.
And that ties directly into how the sources address the concept of God's structured order versus human chaos.
Submitting to God's providence means submitting to his design in every area of life.
Yes. The sources note that by upholding biblical distinctions established at creation, such as gender roles and family structures, the church stands as a light against societal chaos.
When a culture systematically dismantles the family and embraces confusion regarding human identity, it is another manifestation of humanity trying to seize the pen and write its own reality.
By living according to the Scriptures, the church displays the peaceful, orderly kingdom of God. It is a tangible, daily way to submit to the author's script rather than acting like an autonomous director.
I think this doctrine brings such immense tangible comfort when we face dark providences.
It absolutely does.
If you are a listener dealing with intense opposition right now, maybe slander at your workplace, or facing a medical diagnosis you did not expect, or watching your carefully laid plans completely collapse, well, we cannot see the full script from where we are standing on the stage.
But we can trust the author on the balcony.
The enemies of Christ, the hostile forces of culture, the obstacles in our way are never truly sovereign. They are unwitting instruments in a much larger story.
We so often stand inside the narrative, blinded by our limited horizontal perspective. What appears tangled, chaotic, and senseless to us is perfectly ordered before him.
What appears as a painful delay is precisely appointed timing.
Yes, what looks like a final defeat, a 75-foot gallows or a Roman cross, may be the exact road God is paving toward your provision and his glory.
The cross of Christ guarantees that God governs even the things that grieve us, and he will govern them to secure the final good of his people.
That is a wonderful summary.
So we have seen that the dramatic irony we read in the English Bible is far more than a literary device to keep us entertained. It is a robust historical testimony to the meticulous governance of God over the insomnia of pagan kings, the calculating plots of corrupt priests, and the blood-bought salvation of his people.
It is a remarkable truth to rest in.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. Think back to that balcony overlooking the stage. If the Almighty can orchestrate the hostile decrees of a massive Persian empire, and if he can utilize the murderous intentions of a high priest to secure the salvation of the world, how might the confusing, seemingly random obstacles in your own life right now be the precise mechanisms of his unseen, perfect provision?